So welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a record number of early votes cast today in Georgia as the election continues. Starting today throughout the remainder of the election cycle, Georgia will be one of the most closely watched races of this cycle. No competitive Senate race, no competitive governor races, barely any competitive House races. All the focus here is on the presidential race. And Georgia today, shattering their 2020 election record, shattering any other election record ever set in this battleground state when it comes down to early voting on day one of the 2024 election in the battleground state of Georgia. It's a competitive race all across the board. Democrats, Republicans across the state are looking to turn out their demographic bases, looking to turn out their voters, their core constituents, ranging from rural Georgia to urban Atlanta. You are going to find that this race is going to come down to the wire. Likely just thousands of votes will separate the two candidates out of millions cast in this battleground state, with 16 electoral votes up for grab on November 5th, 2024. And this record broken today comes at a time where Democrats are looking across states like Pennsylvania with very high numbers of returns when it comes down to the ballots requested in Pennsylvania on the Democratic side, building up their electoral firewall in the 2024 cycle. In Michigan, you're seeing high return rates in urban areas. The Democrats are looking to again also build up their firewall. Since the 2020 election, including the 2022 midterms, the 2023 off-year elections, including even the 2021 off-year elections, Democrats have been voting at a higher rate earlier on, voting by mail, voting absentee, in every different type of format that isn't really traditional on election day voting. Republicans have been primarily voting on election day, and it's proven to be problematic to some extent. Back in 2022 in Nevada, a race that Democrats really turned out the early vote, Republicans went to vote on election day. A huge snowstorm hit many Republican areas across the state. Ultimately wasn't consequential enough that I would even argue it would have given Republicans a victory had the snowstorm not hit. But it's circumstances like those that really emphasize why early voting has always been this benefit for Democrats, and not to mention that voting early, getting in your ballot, already being checked off as someone who has voted, always benefits the party that is using money and resources to turn you out to vote. And so when you find areas like Atlanta that are seeing record numbers of early votes, you're going to find that this really does help the Democratic Party nearly entirely, right? We don't know how this early vote is going to go, but what we do know is that when people are excited and inspired to vote, the standard convention has been, with very limited exception, the higher voter turnout is, the better for the Democratic Party. And the Georgia Secretary of State's office announced that roughly 252,000 ballots have been cast as of Tuesday. They said this was, quote, spectacular turnout. I mean, the previous record on the first day, if you remember, was set back in 2020. We talked about it back then, about how that was good news for Democrats in 2020. They broke their record, surpassing 2016, and they did so in 2020, and everyone argued this is a COVID number. This is a number that can't be replicated. It can't be beat because it's coming at a time where voters are looking to avoid long lines, avoid being in areas and spaces alongside other people. And the 2020 election was the highest turnout we have seen in a presidential election since the year 1900. I mean, I kid you not, the last time before the 2020 election we saw turnout that high was before the sinking of the Titanic. And so in the 2020 election, when the early numbers really broke here, it was really good. 91,000 was really good for Democrats, really good for Georgia, voters back in 2016. In 2020, it went to roughly 130,000 early votes cast. This time, 252,000 votes cast. This is really going to do something very different for the state of Georgia. Maybe it's the heavy investments in the state from both parties. In 2016, you didn't see that. In 2012, you didn't see that. In 2008, you didn't see that. 2020 was the real first time that both parties invested millions upon millions, tens upon millions of dollars, in this race here. Georgia is no different in 2024. In fact, experts estimate that Georgia will have more money spent on it this cycle than in the last cycle, and you've already started to see it outpacing in fundraising numbers and campaign visits and the style of campaign. Kamala Harris being the first Democrat to campaign outside of the Atlanta metro area to win it on a presidential level since, Bill Clinton era, and that was the last time Democrats won Georgia before Biden, 1992. Biden's 2020 game was Atlanta. Now Kamala Harris is really trying to branch out. Regardless, though, in Georgia, massive turnout honestly is something Democrats should celebrate, because the areas at which you're seeing the turnout come from are areas that you need Democrats really to do well in, right? And you're talking about areas like Atlanta, and you're seeing that the messaging here from Democrats, this isn't going to, result in a massive victory for Democrats, but what it is doing here is Democrats are clearly communicating effectively with their voting bases. That we're saying, back in 2020, There were more mail-in ballots, right? You could have voted easier from home. Now, if you want to vote in person, you're going to have lines. Georgia's made it more difficult. We can no longer pass out water. We can no longer pass out anything for those waiting in line. We can't even do the ballot drop boxes the same way back in 2020 when they were active and open 24/7. You could go to them whenever you wanted, fill out your ballot, drop it off. There's significantly less of them in Georgia. What Georgia Republicans did after the 2020 election cycle, and it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you are on, they did this under the guise of election security, and what they did was actively tried to stifle the voters in the state of Georgia. Whether, this is something that we can get into and tussle over. It is something that is well documented by nonpartisan institutes as something that was intentionally done to decrease the amount of people voting by mail, which benefits Democrats, decrease the amount of people that are voting absentee. When I say, by mail, you're going to have them mail it in physically going to their mailbox, but also people go to drop boxes, reducing the number of early voting days on days like Sunday. Souls to the polls is a huge thing for the Democratic Party. You will find that, black congregations will intentionally try to get buses and people after service going to the ballot box. Republicans decided to scrap that. They reduced the early voting period all across. You're going to find that Georgia Republicans did an intentional effort. Why? Because they only lost Georgia by 11,000 votes in the 2020 election. 11,000 votes separated Joe Biden and Donald Trump out of over 5 million cast. 5 million cast. And so when you keep that in mind, it is clearly an intentional effort here. And that's what I mean when I say you are going to see that this is something that was good for Democrats because they're clearly messaging correctly. I don't think, the sudden influx of 100,000 more people going out to vote early today versus a year ago is something that's going to be, or 4 years ago rather, is something that means Democrats are on track for a landslide. But what it does mean is that they're doing something correctly. They're mobilizing the base. They're getting out the vote. And that's good for Democrats, and honestly, just in an overall democracy when it comes down to the amount of people that are voting and voting and voting. And in all of these conversations around how Biden swung Georgia left, a big answer to this was that they made voting accessible for a state where you have seen untapped potential when it comes down to key demographic groups that Democrats traditionally win. And what I mean by that is when you're looking at a presidential election, where can Democrats mobilize their base? Look back at 2016. The big thing about 2016 was that you saw that voters in areas like Atlanta, you saw decreased African-American turnout. You saw decreased Latino and Hispanic turnout. You saw decreased Asian-American turnout, even from the 2012 election. And even though Georgia swung from being a state Mitt Romney won by 9 to a state that Hillary Clinton lost by 5.1, you're looking at a 4-point swing that happened. Why? Because white suburban voters shifted away from Donald Trump. Democrats knew that they were going to win over more suburbanites in 2020 than they did in, 2016 and especially in 2012. What was the demographic of Romney and McCain is no longer the demographic of Donald Trump. But what Democrats needed to do differently in 2020 was not only capitalize on that movement that moved away from Trump and towards Hillary Clinton, but combine it with a robust turnout program amongst minority voters in Georgia in specific, bringing out congregations of people to vote for Kamala Harris from all different parts of the state, inspiring regardless of demographic group, regardless of age range, race, financial background, all of these things. The Democratic Party knew they needed it all. Why? Because they hadn't won Georgia since 1992. They knew how intense this lift would be, but they were devoted to it. They were devoted to making this happen. And looking at the results here, it is clear. Every single voter contacted, every single digital ad, every single TV ad, every single stop, every single intentional effort in Georgia paid off for the Democratic Party. Why? Because it was the closest race of the 2020 presidential election, and it barely even went to Joe Biden despite all of these investments. And so I remember, too, Georgia had record-breaking turnout. Early voting brought it forth. It gave us an indication of what we could and might expect on Election Day. And the fact remains, Democrats are the most likely group of voters to vote early because of Donald Trump's intentional disinformation campaign surrounding mail-in, absentee, early voting, saying all of these things were rigged. They're going to funnel it all in on Election Day, so you need to vote on Election Day. Now, his campaign team's trying to walk it back. They're trying to get everyone this plan to vote, do all of these things, to be, more out in there rather than, focusing on just on Election Day voting. But it doesn't work perfectly when you've spent the past, 4 years, going after this system, I almost said a word that I should not be saying on here, but going after a system that clearly is something that Democrats were able to use to their advantage when you're going after it, right? This is something that really just speaks to the general political instincts of the Trump team that I never believed to be that robust. They got lucky in 2016 and they have lost every election subsequently. And honestly speaking, these early voting numbers do in fact inform predictions. They inform our understandings of how elections are going. And if this election is anything like 2022 and obviously anything like 2020, it's bad news for the Trump team. And based on some of these early voting numbers, it's looking better than 2020 when it comes down to the amount of people that are voting today. Now, I get it. This is not a number that can predict the election that simply. This is something that just contributes, again, like I'm saying, to this general understanding of how this race might go. But you can't cut it any other way than knowing that this is a good number for the Democratic Party. Does it mean they're going to be guaranteed victory? Probably not, right? I mean, I still think Democrats can win Georgia. I've had Donald Trump have this state in the column for the past month and a half, but I still believe there is a circumstance, and it's a likely one, that Democrats win Georgia. I just don't think it's the likeliest circumstance right now, but I wouldn't be shocked, especially looking at numbers like these and knowing what Biden did. It seems to be a coalition that, you're going to see Democrats build up to. Another thing that we just haven't discussed too heavily this cycle is the increased amount of voter registration. Just plainly put, the Democratic Party has done a really good job at mobilizing these voters that did not vote in 22, did not vote in 2020, did not vote in 2016. These are voters out there that didn't even vote in the highest turnout election we had seen in over a century that are now turning out to vote in this cycle. And young voters too, routinely you will find young voters are the least engaged demographic group when it comes down to age. But what you're finding is that the presidential race has increased voter registrations in Georgia once Kamala Harris got to the top of the ticket. When you're looking at 1 week periods, for instance, black women added 75 more registrations than in the same period in 2020. You are seeing an increase that Kamala Harris is surging the amount of voter registration, specifically amongst black women and even more broadly amongst women in general. You saw it happen in 2022. When Roe v. Wade was overturned, there were states like Kansas that had an abortion referendum set to take place just weeks after the decision. With all this campaigning and all this time, the Democratic Party saw a massive surge in women voting, a massive surge in women registration, rather, in the state of Kansas, all in anticipation of an abortion referendum that was going to hit their ballots that coming August. It's something that we have seen happen before with the right type of candidate, the right type of enthusiasm, the right type of messaging, and all of this ground game, all of this get out the vote effort, all of this works in a combined effort to get one person elected. And in this circumstance, when the numbers show good results in the voter registration numbers, and now they're showing good results in the actual voting numbers, this is a good sign for the Harris campaign. It's not a done deal yet. It absolutely could go to Donald Trump's team, but it is always a good thing when you see that voters are higher up, when you're looking at it from the perspective of the Democratic Party. And I'd be fascinated to see if these numbers actually do shift away from the Harris campaign with more voters out there. If voter turnout ends up being higher than 2020 and Kamala Harris loses some support, maybe we need to reevaluate some of our standard notions and conventions about elections. But I don't know if we're at that point yet. And so, all in all, what I would say we take away from this is not enough to say, like I've been saying for the 12th time now, probably even more, that Kamala Harris is guaranteed the presidency through Georgia, or at least that she's guaranteed Georgia. But it is a good sign when you see enthusiasm this high for the Democratic Party. They have clearly done something right. You can see it in the voter registration numbers. You can see it in the rally numbers. You can see it in the fundraising numbers. You can see it in the polling numbers. She's doing a lot better than Biden. Is she winning in the state on average, though? The answer is no, which is why these numbers here, these real factual election results, sometimes stand in direct contrast with what we might estimate based on polling numbers, based on, graphics, based on all these different things that sometimes do inform our reasoning, sometimes do inform our understanding of elections. But still, at the end of the day, Georgia is going to be extremely competitive. There were a lot of numbers that would have said that Joe Biden was going to walk away with this race. Remember that massive bump that we saw on the 6th of November? Why did this happen? A lot of those absentee ballots that were able to be counted after Election Day boosted up in there. Why did that happen too? You see, a lot of voters, shatter that record back in 2020. What was 91,000 people voting to 136,000? You'd think maybe that 40,000 were going straight to Biden. The answer was no. It was still a competitive race. It was still a race that was really down to the wire, and it didn't make much of a difference overall, right? It did shift in favor of the Democratic Party. They absolutely made up ground, right, based on the 2016 election by far, but it still wasn't something that I would have said, early voting this day, I could have predicted immediately that Biden was going to win the election. There were a lot of other factors, a lot of other things, and clearly you saw, of 136,000 are voting on election day, but we end up reaching 4 million, right? Reaching that point right before the election, then we end up reaching somewhere around 5 million statewide. Things are really hard to just pinpoint on one individual day. And so I wouldn't go so far as to saying it's a day that dictates all, but it does come pretty darn close to understanding a bit about the election, enthusiasm, what people are willing to do versus not. And it seems very much that Kamala Harris is at a point where she's in a good place in Georgia today, might not be the same answer tomorrow. But overall, something to talk about and discuss, because every single vote, every single effort, every single thing will matter in the 2024 cycle, and we're getting closer to this election being over. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server if you need to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.